Hi, my name is Matt Ellinwood. I'm the Director of the Education and Law Project at the North Carolina Justice Center. Thank you for joining us today, where we're going to talk a little bit about North Carolina's education funding system. Just to give a bit of an overview, I think we're going to talk about the adequacy of the overall system and how it compares to other states, but we're also going to get into a little bit of detail about how the different allotments work. And this is significant because over the coming next couple of years, there's likely going to be a review of North Carolina's school funding formula. And so any changes to these different allotments are going to mean that our local schools in different counties are going to have different amounts of resources than they currently have. So it's really important to gain a better understanding of how this whole system works, because it is about to potentially be changed in some significant ways. Just to give a quick overview of the system, North Carolina has 115 different school districts. These school districts differ incredibly in terms of the size, the student characteristics, demographics. There's a lot of diversity, but overall there are 1.5 million public school students enrolled in over 2,600 different public schools across the state. A lot of that enrollment growth that we've seen in the state over the last few decades has really been concentrated in urban districts, as well as in a really rapid growth of charter schools, particularly since 2011, when the cap of 100 schools on charter schools was lifted. We've seen significant growth in charter school enrollment in that period of time. In terms of the funding system, overall our schools are funded primarily through three different sources: state, local, and federal. North Carolina is kind of unique in that our Constitution places the primary responsibility for funding schools on the state. Part of that was just a recognition during the Great Depression that a lot of counties did not have enough revenue to support their own school system, and that if the state didn't step in and take that bigger role, then we were going to have areas of our state that weren't even going to have access to public education. And so since the state wanted to commit to every student having the right to enroll in public schools, that is enshrined in our Constitution, that the state bears the primary responsibility of funding. So the state provides over about 62% of the funding, of per pupil funding. 26% comes from local sources and 12% from federal. Just to compare that to the national average, it's more like 50-50, or actually a majority would be provided locally. So that is a difference. So sometimes you'll see things like North Carolina ranks 7th in the percentage of funding that comes from the state. Well, it's not a particularly meaningful statistic. It tells us that the state's providing most of the funding, but it doesn't mean that we are 7th in terms of per pupil expenditures or anything like that. We'll get to that later. We're actually, we've languished in the bottom 10 states in that statistic every year over the last almost decade. In terms of responsibilities, just the state is going to do the kind of bigger picture policies, technical assistance, oversight, managing resources, providing teacher pay, and funds for the management of the overall system, whereas the LEAs, the local education agency, which is going to be your school district or charter schools, they decide on the resource allocation between schools. So once the money is sent to the county, they decide how to divide it up into the different schools in the county. And they also do things like handle obviously the day-to-day operations and hiring of personnel. Just to talk a little bit about federal funds, and I think this is significant because, as we mentioned, more than 10% of our funding for our public schools comes from federal sources, and we've seen some proposals at the federal level for things like a national voucher program or tax credit, which is similar to vouchers, that would cost about $20 billion. And that really is all of the federal funding that goes to education. So right now that money goes to 37% of that money goes to child nutrition, free and reduced lunch for low-income students. 31% is Title I funding, also targeted towards that's for the academic, to support academic initiatives for low-income students, and 22% goes to individuals with disabilities under the Individuals with Disability Education Act. So all of the federal money is used to support really vulnerable populations. So when we hear about these proposals to use the money for things like vouchers, we have to think about what does it mean for the funding that is currently being directed, again, towards our most vulnerable students in the lowest income areas that have the least ability to raise local money, just because the incomes are so low in those areas. In terms of all the revenues, where they come from for this, this is state funding. We spend about over $9 billion on K-12 education in the state. The overwhelming majority of that comes from the general fund. That's $8.7 billion. And Just the reason I break this out is because a lot of people will say, well, what about the lottery? Don't we have this education lottery that provides a ton of money for education? How could our schools be underfunded? And the lottery does provide a substantial amount, or generates a substantial amount of money. It's for this past year, it was $372 million. There are two problems with that, though. One is that, as I mentioned, the overall budget is $8.7 billion, so lottery funding is a very small percentage of the overall amount that's spent on public education. The other problem is that the original legislation included a non-supplant requirement, which means that school districts couldn't use lottery funding to support services they were already providing. You couldn't just take out your local money or your state money and sub in this lottery money. That provision has been removed, and over time we've seen the lotteries really being used to fund a lot of things that aren't supplemental, that are really essential elements of our education system. And at this point, most of it is being spent on non-instructional support personnel. So a lot less of that money is finding its way into the classrooms than it used to. In terms of as I mentioned, there is a complicated system of allotments in the state. A lot of other states will use what's called a base student funding model, where we'll look at each student and as an individual and direct money based on their needs. So you get an adjustment for things like students with disabilities. They might require aides or additional teachers, so they get a little bit more funding. Same thing with limited English proficient students. Same thing with academically and intellectually gifted students. So they also make adjustments for things like the cost of living in your area, or whether you're in a low wealth county or a large county that's sparsely populated, so you have higher transportation costs. All things that are designed to make the system align with what the actual costs are for educating each individual child. Our system works a little differently, where we have a bunch of allotments that are designed to do that same thing. It's just a little harder to follow them because there's dozens of them and they each have their own formula, so it's a little difficult as a taxpayer to really get a good sense of where your money's going. But the overwhelming majority of it is going to what's called base allotments. Those are provided to local education agencies based on the number of students, based on student head count. So examples would be classroom teachers. For every X number of students, you will be provided a teacher, and it varies by grade. We have smaller classes in the earlier grades. Same thing with textbooks. There's one textbook for certain numbers of students in the head count. Then we've got things that are LEA-based, which are provided on characteristics of the district. So that's sort of what I was mentioning earlier, the weighted funding idea. If you're a small county or a low-wealth county, you'll receive additional resources from the state, and low wealth is if you're below the state median income. And then there are some student-based allocations for limited English proficient students and children with disabilities. So those are just set amounts. It's around $4,000 per student for children with disabilities and a little over $400 for students who are limited English proficient. There are some serious questions about whether either of those are adequate amounts. I think they don't compare very favorably to other states. The other problem with them is they're both capped, which is a little odd. So for children with disabilities, for example, you can only receive funding as a district up to 12.5% of students who have disabilities in your district. So if 20% of the students in your districts have disabilities, you'll still only receive funding as if 12.5% did. And that's designed to help students, to prevent students from being over-identified with disabilities. But the problem is more than half the districts are already over that cap, even though they have no incentive to over-identify, given this cap. So that's something that I think needs to be looked at when this is reviewed, what's a way we can set some sort of cap to provide that protection, but still provides adequate funding to districts that have large concentrations of students with disabilities. There are two different types of allotments that are, there's the position-based and dollar allotments. So you can see it's already getting complicated. There's a lot of different types of allotments, but the position allotments are kind of similar to the base allotments I mentioned, where they're based on head count. So the LEA will actually receive funding for a classroom teacher, and it's not a theoretical teacher. It's actually based on the teacher's characteristics. So if you have a very experienced teacher, that teacher will be paid more, and the state will send you funds to provide for that specific teacher. And that's one of the things that's been identified in the funding formula as potentially having an issue where a lot of the higher income districts that are easier to staff and more desirable to a lot of teachers that have salary supplements and things like that, also they attract more experienced teachers. So in a way, we're diverting more resources to some of the higher income districts, and we have more inexperienced teachers in lower income districts. So it's not an intentional misallocation of resources, but it does have that effect of sending more state money to districts that have lower needs. Teaching assistants are funded a little differently. The LEA has provided a set dollar amount, and then they manage those funds and hire the teaching assistants however they want, so they can do part-time things like that. So it's a little different where you're not receiving it based on the actual teaching assistant, you're just receiving a set dollar amount. Position allotments are the overwhelming majority of our system. So I think that's something that we'll talk about in a second, but really most of this goes to specific positions rather than just dollars that the districts have a lot of freedom to spend. One quick term you'll see a lot, because I mentioned a lot of this funding is based on student headcounts. What we mean by student headcounts is you'll hear average daily membership a lot, or ADM. It really does mean the average number of students who are there on a given day, not necessarily everyone who's enrolled in the school. We will kind of hold districts harmless if they're shrinking. So when calculating the ADM, they'll choose either the highest ADM of the first 2 months of the school year or the projection for next year. And that way we don't have districts losing money on a year-to-year basis, because that works a major hardship, and we often see people getting laid off, which is another thing to think about as we do this funding formula, that if we create a system where there are winners and losers, that would mean some districts would receive less funding than they did the year before, and that almost always necessitates the loss of some people's jobs and teaching positions. And the reason for that is because 94% of state expenditures goes towards salary and benefits. Teachers, counselors, non-instructional support personnel, school nurses, janitors, all of those folks who make the schools go. That's really, we do an amazing job of directing so much of the resources towards salary and benefits. I think we do need to think about, 1% of it is going towards instructional equipment, 3% is going towards supplies and materials. So while the state has done a pretty good job of directing more money towards teacher pay, and that's incredibly important, we don't want to think the mission is accomplished if we're not sending enough money towards our classrooms. And that is something that's a support for teachers, that we need to make sure that they're in school classrooms that have small class size, that have adequate textbooks, up-to-date instructional materials. That really has a big impact on the ability to recruit and retain teachers, because it gets to their quality of life and how things look on the classroom level for them. The per pupil expenditures, if you adjust for inflation, are a little over $8,800 right now, and that compares to in 2008, 2009, they were over $9,600. So we still haven't returned our per pupil expenditure levels to where they were before the Great Recession. You might see it in raw dollars where it looks like it's gone up, but you really do have to adjust for those increasing costs in retirement and transportation and things like that are going up rather quickly. So when you adjust for inflation, we're way down on that from where we were 8 years ago. And that has bared out of where we are in terms of the national average, where we are ranked in the bottom, as I mentioned, we're consistently ranked in the bottom 10 states, but right now we've kind of fallen a little bit in that from 2014-15 to 2015-16, and are currently ranked about, depending on which measure you look at, 44th in the country. And that's something where we really made major strides by investing in education in the late 90s and early 2000s, and moved North Carolina up to the point where it was average or above average compared to other states in terms of student performance. And now that as our commitment to funding schools has fallen off, our performance has really stagnated at that point. And it's going to take sort of easier to move to the middle to the average. You have to really do something, I think, more affirmative if you want to have one of the best education systems in the country. And so that's going to require a similar recommitment to public education to what we saw in the 90s and 2000s that moved us to where we were one of the states that a lot of people were focusing on as having made the greatest improvements over that period of time. If we want to see a similar type of improvement going forward, it's pretty clear that we're going to have to work on where we are in terms of per pupil expenditure, because money does matter when it comes to education. It's what provides the resources for things like pre-kindergarten, for remediation, for work supports, tutoring, mentoring. These are all things that the students need to be successful at this point, and it's all linked to funding. So thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it. We hope that you will continue to tune into our different events as we follow up and continue to follow these bills. Thank you.